Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to all of you to this afternoon's session, hosted here today by Business Day Focus 4.0 Live, brought to you in partnership with Oracle. Today, I'm hugely excited about the topic we will be unpacking with our experts and thought leaders today. But perhaps for me, I'm also looking forward to learning. If there's one thing that 2020 has taught all of us is to keep an open mind, to keep revisiting, pivoting, and even innovating on our thoughts and our processes within our businesses as well. But perhaps more importantly, how do we very quickly take the new things and the mountainous amounts of information that is constantly streaming at us from various functions in our businesses as well, and very quickly convert that into knowledge that becomes useful to our decision-making processes. My name is Lynette Nduli, and this afternoon I will be your moderator for this session as we unpack business sustainability. But perhaps more importantly, we begin to take an incisive look at why scenario planning as a tool in your business is absolutely essential to the way you work, to the way you make some of the decisions, to how you even partner strategically within your business, and how you ultimately are able to deliver value, results, as well as impact with your team members to your clients in your different ecosystems and industrial sectors. 2020 has certainly taught us that nothing is guaranteed. And with that, we can take nothing for granted. The unpredictability as well as the volatility that this year has shown in not only in many of our personal lives, our leadership journeys, as well as in our businesses, the teams that we lead, and even amongst the people we both serve with, but also serve on the outside of our enterprises, means that with that in mind, we have got to build shock absorbers into our systems, resilience into our teams, and we've got to build different buffers and different ways of thinking and doing, of course, and still somehow get the same results, or if it's a different result, it's then as a result that hopefully will be worth each of our while. As part of this discussion today, brought to you by Business Day and Oracle, we will also specifically be looking at the benefits of effective scenario planning within the realm of the development of our strategies, as we all continue each and every day to face the unknown and the unexpected. As we continue with today's program, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to interact and engage with us. And so for this purpose, we will have our chat open. And should you wish to pose a specific question to one of my guests and panelists, you are welcome to. And I will make sure that as we continue with this program, those get attended to for the purposes of today. Now, I know that each of you have a circle of influence far wider than that is joining us this afternoon at this webinar. And so if you are using your social as well as digital platforms this afternoon to share some of the ideas, the thoughts, and some of the tips you may gain from this particular session, please help us to spread the word beyond this audience by using the hashtags BDF4, the number 4, underscore scenario planning, or simply tag Oracle_Africa to your comments. And I'll also certainly be following just some of the things that you're saying, some of the questions perhaps that you're asking, and some of the best practice that you may already be implementing into your different spaces. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to waste any more time because I know lunch hour is a very precious time. And I'm going to introduce to all of you this afternoon, Wayne Heather. Wayne, ladies and gentlemen, is the director of the EMP product marketing at Oracle, a gentleman who has a very vast track record and experiences in building solutions for enterprise clients using various tools and resources, and therefore a man who probably has to do a fair amount of not just listening, but also a fair amount of mapping out different scenarios and different outcomes to make sure that the products he develops are best aligned to the solutions and services that his clients demand. Wayne, if you can please come on now. In a room, we would ordinarily clap our hands, but for this purpose, Wayne will now come up onto your screens, ladies and gentlemen, and present some of his thoughts around what he's learned, but perhaps more importantly, what he also sees as some key threads and key priorities in the business of scenario planning. Wayne, Heather, over to you.
Excellent, Lynette. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you today and share a little bit about what I guess I and Oracle are seeing in the market with some of our customers, specifically around what's happened. So, you know, if we look at what's going on now, we're going through a very interesting time. I don't think any of us expected something like this to happen earlier this year, but I guess the good news is disruptive events are not that new. We've been through disruptive events before, and the good news is, you know, the sun will shine, things will get better, and eventually we will get back to, I guess, some sort of normality. What it is at the moment, no one really knows. And you know, that kind of, I guess, brings me to my next point is, you know, we've all gone through, if you can remember September the 11th, we've gone through the recession in 2008. There's been, you know, a whole bunch of different crises, but this one is slightly different. And what makes this one different? I guess, you know, the first thing is there was a high uncertainty that was caused, and the fact that this has impact on just about every industry. You know, no one knew what it would look like, how long it will last, how long it is going to last, and you know what the new norm, I guess, is going to look like. It's also caused the highest level of employment that we've seen in decades globally. Okay, and governments are acting to combat that and help citizens, I guess, with massive stimulus packages. And then also, if you look at the impact across different industries, every different industry is being impacted slightly differently. Some industries have really, I guess, prospered in terms of what's going through. If you look at online platforms, you know, Lynette just mentioned, ordinarily we would be in a room, some fancy conference center, speaking live, but at the moment, you know, we're all sat around the world sitting at our desks. So Zoom, for example, you know, has done tremendously well out of this pandemic. But then if you look on the other hand, if you look at airlines, for example, airlines have suffered because, you know, we can't travel. I know last night there was big news in South Africa where the government announced that the borders are now open. So hopefully you'll see the travel and tourism industry slowly starting to take a resurgence. But you know, every industry is being impacted differently, and these macro level impacts, I guess, have been driving decisions and uncertainty at a very much a micro level within organizations. So what have we seen organizations doing? The first thing, I guess, is, you know, the stuff that I talk to my customers about is really around the Office of Finance, looking at you know, planning, budgeting, financial consolidation, etc. And the first thing is, you know, the plans that they had when they came into the new year were all irrelevant, right? All their plans were upended, and the expectations for, I guess, every industry and business has just changed. You know, a lot of organizations had to evaluate their business in terms of looking at the way they operate and how can they change what they're doing. And they had to do that fairly quickly to kind of stay on track to weather the storm, as it were. You know, I've spoken about different industries which have been impacted in different ways, but I think the common thread that we've seen throughout all our customers really is that, you know, there's been a few different I guess phases or stages, whatever you want to call them, with this pandemic, right? The first one was, you know, if you look at lockdown, being able to carry on as normal with all the employees working remotely. We've seen a massive resurgence in customers wanting to look at cloud platforms, digital platforms. You know, I know at Oracle, we kind of drink our own champagne, so to speak, and we've implemented our own cloud finance platforms. And we were able, despite the fact that suddenly everybody had to work from home, we were able to close our books 20% faster than normal. Okay, because we had this, we were lucky enough to have gone to the cloud and be resilient to enable that. So I guess collaboration was the first thing that customers wanted to look at. And then the second thing, I guess, was just being able to weather the storm. So, you know, how do they make sure that they can conserve cash? How do they look at cutting costs? How do they look at modeling workforces? How do they look at modeling different business impacts? So, you know, we're all in lockdown. So if you're in retail, for example, all the shops are going to close. So if I'm a bricks and mortar retail, how do I quickly pivot my business to online? And is that the right thing to do, or should I look at a different business model? So those are the things that we're helping our customers do. And the way we've helped them is being able to be agile using scenario modeling in a really effective way. And one of our customers actually, you know, talking to him a while back, he gave us a quote that said, flexibility and agility is key more now than ever. So it's been able to really quickly do forecasting, to focus on multiple forecasts or scenarios, model these scenarios really, really quickly, and develop KPIs that are specific, I guess, for the pandemic at the moment. Instead of the normal forecasting that people use, which, you know, is maybe an annual rolling forecast, you know, people have changed that to do a lot of scenario modeling, and that's the focus that they're doing. So it's you know, doing lots of forecasting, but with very short range, because things are changing almost month by month, right? So how do we deal with that? How do we make sure that we can quickly pivot our business and steer the ship in the right direction based on what's happening outside? You know, I guess the questions that you've got to address is, you know, how long will this pandemic last? It looks like we're coming to the end, and we should be looking at modeling what our future is going to look like. You know, are we conserving cash? Will we run out of cash? Looking at, you know, what debtors are doing. You know, some companies, if you're in the retail space, again, I guess a lot of retailers aren't paying rent. Their shops are closed. Why should I pay rent? So how do you deal with those things? And also a big thing is customer behaviors have changed, right? A lot of us are sitting at home, we're ordering groceries online, we shopping and buying a lot of things online that typically we'd buy in stores. So, you know, those are the things that customers are looking at. And you know, using our scenario modeling platform, we find that we've been able to help our customers, I guess, weather the storm and move forward that way. There are a few customer examples. I'm not going to steal Kimberly's thunder, but I think she'll cover off a few examples during the panel discussion. But I guess I hope that sets the scene, and I'd like to carry on now. I think hand over to Kartik.
Thank you so much to Wayne Heather for setting the scene this afternoon in terms of some of the priorities, but I think some of them perhaps more seismic and most impactful changes that you and I are seeing, not just in our personal lives, but also in our business lives as we navigate this new unknown as opposed to a normal, as it were. I'm going to welcome our next speaker, though, on the screen, who's going to expand on some of the thoughts that Wayne has already shared with us today in terms of how we now move forward and what this new path begins to look like, feel like, and even contextually change for us in our different working environments. It's a great pleasure this afternoon to welcome Mr. Kartik Jairam, who heads up the public and social sector practice across the EMEA region on behalf of McKinsey. He is based in Nairobi, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about some of the experiences that he's had across the region itself. But perhaps more importantly, and to Wayne's point, they say if you don't adapt quickly and you don't adopt agility, you will soon face fragility, if not a complete fail within your business as a whole. So here we are being called on to pivot, to rapidly change and implement through our processes, our systems, and even our people. Kartik, welcome to the webinar this afternoon, and we look forward to you sharing a little bit more of your experiences as we chart new paths and new ways.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Lynette, and thank you for that very nice introduction. And it was also very nice to hear from Wayne as he set the stage. So what I thought I'd do, and I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully you can see that, is to talk a little bit about what we might see coming next. So beyond the virus itself, what might the path to the next normal or the new normal might look like? So some thoughts on that is what I'll spend some time talking about today, and then hand it over back to you, Lynette. So before I start, I think we'll talk a lot about the economy. We'll talk a lot about what businesses should do and so on. But I do want to acknowledge that COVID-19, first and foremost, is a humanitarian challenge. It's a global challenge. And a lot of people are battling this heroically. And I think that's probably the most important thing beyond all the other stuff that we will probably talk about. So I wanted to acknowledge that as a starting point. Before I get into what might happen going forward, maybe just a couple of minutes on what's actually happened and what we've seen in Africa in particular. We talk about COVID-19 as one crisis, but actually, I think of what we're seeing this year as Africa facing three different crises. And the reason I say that is there's one which is sort of the global pandemic, which is causing disruption in global supply chains, lower demand for goods from Africa to global markets, reduction in investments, and so on. So that I'll call that as crisis one, which is the global pandemic and how it affects us in Africa. The second crisis is the pandemic in Africa itself, which is limited movement of people. It's disrupting lots of different ways of working. It's changing the patterns of what we can do and so on, really caused by the health crisis here itself, right? The third crisis, in some ways, has nothing to do with COVID, but it's happening at the same time, which is the impact of oil prices and the crash in that. And that's affecting certain countries, especially the oil producers in Africa, in a pretty significant way. So the impact we're seeing across the continent is a net effect across all these three things that we're seeing this year. So it's almost being buffeted by three different crises at the same time. We modeled what the effect of these three crises might be on Africa. And there are many different ways to model this. The y-axis on this page looks at the potential spread at the global level, a contained virus versus resurgence. We're seeing some resurgence, obviously, in Europe and the US at this time. And the x-axis talks about the same spread of COVID, whether it's contained or widespread in Africa, and how that might play out. Regardless of which scenario you might believe, and this shows you different scenarios, Africa this year is likely to face an economic contraction. We'll see this by the end of the year, and we'll show exact numbers. But regardless of which way we model it, we're looking at a pretty significant economic shock across the continent. Now, this plays out differently in different countries, by the way. In the oil producers, it actually plays out much more negatively than you're even seeing in these scenarios. Whereas in countries like in East Africa, which are oil importers, it plays out slightly a bit better because the starting point was actually also a bit higher. But what that also means is, from an overall GDP standpoint, from what was expected pre-COVID, which was about 3.9% growth pre-COVID for this year, we're going to potentially see 0 to negative potential growth this year in Africa. We'll see what exactly happens. The other effect that we're seeing is essentially what's happening to jobs, to livelihoods. And here, we believe about 1/3 of all jobs in Africa, both formal and informal, are going to be affected in some form, right? Now, affected is either jobs lost. Affected also is salaries going down. These are basically jobs which are vulnerable in some form, basically. And you see that this is cutting across sectors whether it's retail wholesale or construction or tourism or so on. This is a pretty big effect, right? We're talking about 150 million jobs across the continent. The total labor force in Africa is about 450 million people, give or take, of a total population of about 1.2 billion. So we're talking a very significant impact on people's lives. That's what we're seeing at an aggregate level. So then the question becomes, how are companies, governments, everybody reacting to this? And we think of this in 3 chapters. So chapter 1 was sort of real resolution to do something, or resolve, and resilience is something Wayne also talked about earlier. Chapter 2 is return, right, which is sort of in some ways where we are right now. And chapter 3, which is what I'll talk about a little bit more, is how do we reimagine African economies and how do we reform the economies coming out of this crisis? So those are sort of what we call sort of the 5 R's of what we're seeing, or the 5 stages of this crisis this year. So as we've thought about this crisis and talked to a variety of leaders, both CEOs across the continent, other leaders, NGO leaders, government leaders, we've sort of coalesced around sort of 9 big ideas that we think could make a big difference across the continent. We sort of bucketed them in 3 broad areas. The first is around reimagining society. And there are 3 sort of big concepts here. One, which won't be any surprise, and Wayne sort of alluded to it in his opening, is accelerating Africa's digital transformation. Whether it's digital in terms of social services, but also digital across the board on private companies providing services to consumers and businesses as well. That's sort of a big theme, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Number 2 is, historically, governments in Africa, development agencies focusing on Africa, focused a lot on the rural poor. We are noticing that this crisis is affecting the urban poor very, very significantly. So we think there's going to be a renewed focus on the urban poor and the urban populations going forward. So that's going to be, we think, a big theme. Whether it's on sanitation, whether it's on services, whether it's on transport, whether it's on urban planning, all of that, I think, is going to come into focus. A third, fairly obviously, is on transforming healthcare systems, in particular on the resilience of these systems and equity. A lot of work was already being done on it. I think what this crisis has done is really put a really sharp focus on it. That is sort of on the reimagined society bucket. The next theme is around reimagining business and companies. The first one, number 4 here, is strengthening the competitiveness of different sectors. As Wayne talked about in the beginning, different sectors are being impacted very differently. But each sector is going to have to think about innovation and business model reform and agility in a pretty significant way. We're seeing that around the world. And that's, I think, a big theme coming out of this. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Number 5 is reshaping manufacturing. Given the disruption in global supply chains, at least somewhat, I think this is going to be a trend we will see around the world and also in Africa. Number 6 is around catalyzing the formalization of African economies. Africa has about 90 million MSMEs, right? That is a lot of small and medium enterprises, right? So how do we formalize these to be part of the economy in a much bigger way is going to be a big theme, we think, for lots of governments. And how do they also become part of private company value chains in a much more significant way, something that's going to become important. And the last part is reimagine government. Number 7, and we could actually title the whole thing around this, is number 7, I think everybody should prepare for a more active government role in the economy, right? Whether it's a company, whether it's an individual, and whether it's a government bureaucrat herself, this is going to play a role. Government's going to play a much more active role going forward because we're seeing the effect and the importance of that. Number 8 is a different social contract between citizens and government. We think that's going to happen, whether it's in terms of universal health coverage, whether it's in terms of insurance, but also in terms of services, food security, and so on. And number 9 is something we may see, we hope to see, in particular around trade, but also in terms of more cooperation across Africa, whether in terms of procurement of health commodities, around energy trade, stuff like that. We're hoping much more momentum around regional cooperation. So those are 9 sort of significant ideas. I'll take a couple more minutes to go through a couple of them in more detail. I won't go through all of them. Let me take number one in terms of the digital transformation. This page shows a little bit about what we're seeing on what we're calling our digitization index across sectors and across countries and continents. And we're seeing a pretty significant acceleration in Africa post-COVID. We're seeing that in particular in banking and insurance, but we're also starting to see that in wholesale trade and retail. We're starting to see governments trying to move a lot of services onto digital channels, whether it's under investment attraction, provision of, let's call it driving licenses, provision of agriculture subsidies. A lot of that is happening. Education is another one where we're seeing a significant momentum, both with private companies, but also with governments. When we survey CEOs across both Africa and globally, what has been fascinating is they're saying, we're doing stuff faster digitally, almost 43 times more, with more speed than what we'd imagined pre-COVID, right? And that was pretty remarkable. This is 43x in terms of agility and speed. What we thought would take a year is now taking us a couple of weeks. So that's actually pretty phenomenal. And we see that trend continuing in a pretty significant way. Number of things that'll happen, that need to happen for this digital acceleration to happen. I'll pick a couple, right? One is, I think public sector, which supports private sector investment and so on, has so far still been a paper exercise. I think moving this to the digital age is very significant and will actually help companies pretty significantly. The other one is infrastructure investments. We think there is $100 billion of infrastructure investment to universalize broadband access that can happen across Africa. That is a very significant private sector opportunity. And we think there's a huge opportunity for both social and commercial returns by going after this opportunity. I think Wayne alluded to this earlier as well. And we see this happening both with startups, but also large telecom companies and IT companies. So that's on digitization. The second thing, I think, Lynette, you talked about this, is COVID disrupting the structure of businesses? The way we've thought about businesses in our conversations is around two axes, right? The x-axis is the extent of what I'll call negative demand disruption. How much is the demand for your products and services being reduced or changed because of this crisis? And the y-axis is how much is your business model itself being disrupted? And you can plot this in many different ways. We have a particular plot here and what we think is likely to happen, as you'd imagine, sort of the airline industry, the tourism industry, very significantly affected. The demand, massive demand shock. I live in Kenya. The tourism industry essentially collapsed by about 90%, and so on, right? Other sectors, a lot less, like telecom, a lot less disruption in terms of the core demand, obviously even increase in many cases. Agriculture, a little bit less so because it's, I think, more insulated because a lot of it is rural in Africa and so on. But the four quadrants here talk a little bit about what I think companies in these sectors need to do, whether it's about restructuring the company or industry itself in terms of M&A activity on the bottom right third quadrant, all the way to the top left, where we're seeing significant shifts in business models, to the top right, where we're literally seeing whole new businesses, right? New banking models, right? New banks, basically, digital banks coming out, right? New digital insurance companies coming out, right? So we think this company starting to think about where they fall along this matrix and what activities they need to take is something we're seeing a lot of. And then we looked a little bit historically. What happened in the last crisis, right? So we started plotting, and this is in Europe and North America for public companies because we had better data there, and looked at companies that were more resilient versus companies that were not resilient versus the S&P 500, which is the gray axis, gray row in the middle. And you see the pretty significant difference in return to shareholders if you're more resilient. And the strategies that the resilient companies adopted are the ones on the right? In particular, they focused on operating efficiency, conserving cash, focusing on productivity. innovating on business models that I talked about, and also much more strategically thinking about divestitures and acquisitions, really thinking hard about their actual business footprint in a very purposeful manner. It doesn't necessarily mean very large acquisitions. It could also mean a series of bolt-on acquisitions. So that's something we're seeing a lot of resilient companies do, and we think the same pattern is probably what we will see again coming out of this crisis. And the difference on returns is very, very significant. You're almost seeing a 7 percentage point difference year on year, which is over a decade, right? Which is pretty significant. I talked earlier about MSMEs. This is relatively unique for Africa, much more so than many other continents. As I said, there are about 90 million MSMEs across Africa. They account for about 70% of employment in the continent, right? And we've broken this out across sectors and micro and small and medium. As you can see, the micro is very big as well. But the big question really is, how do you get these enterprises to be much more part of the formal economy, both in terms of how do governments support them, but also how do they become part of larger private company value chains in a much more systematic way. Governments have provided a lot of stimulus across Africa. We estimate about $20 billion of support have already been committed by governments. But if you look at what's actually needed, given the amount of job losses, up to $64 billion might be needed, right? So there's going to be a lot of shakeup and a lot of pain, I would say, at this level of enterprise that I think we're going to have to deal with as a continent and the private economy. And then lastly is, I think, something that I think we all need to be prepared for as individuals or corporate leaders. The role of government, I think, is going to change coming out of this crisis. I think, and in my conversations with heads of state or ministers, this is something that's constantly on their minds, right? Where to prioritize, how to intervene, how to make sure they're supporting rather than taking on the role of the private sector. How can they engage with the private sector more proactively? That's actually, we're seeing a lot of very interesting examples across the continent, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's in Ghana, in South Africa, in Kenya. I think this engagement between private sector and government has actually increased dramatically, and we hope that continues going forward. And also the ideas of PPPs, the revival of that in different forms and formats, I think is going to happen because governments are going to be fiscally challenged. So how they think about public-private partnerships to finance different investments, infrastructure investment and others going forward is going to be a pretty important question that we're all going to have to think through collectively. So let me pause there. Hopefully that gives some fodder for a conversation going forward, and hand it back to Lynette.
All right. Thank you so much, Kartik, for sharing some of those great thoughts, but also the aggregation of the type of data and trends that you are beginning to see, not just in the private sector in the region, but also across the public sector as well. I think certainly as I was listening to you, Kartik, it was building a set of questions for me specifically, particularly when you were talking about that this pandemic has not just had an economic impact, but it's impacted on so many spheres of our society and so many ecosystems. And with that, as we create the solutions, we're going to have to weave through not just a lot of complexity, but also weave through quite a lot of new environments as well as new information to get to some of the answers that we're looking for. At this stage, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a little bit more of a broader conversation about scenario planning and weaving in sustainability and integrating it into particularly the finance function in our organizations. And I'm delighted to welcome another guest to the webinar this afternoon who joins us all the way from across the world, Ms. Kimberly Ellison-Taylor. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know that it must be very early in the US at this point in time, but you are bright. We see you there looking bright and ready to have this conversation. Kimberly, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have not ever come across her vast body of work and expertise in this particular space, is currently the executive director at Oracle, who looks at the finance thought leadership segment for this particular business. She's a transformational leader who has worked in various capacities and roles, particularly in the finance and financial services market space, but specifically has helped businesses, governments, different institutions to really help themselves when they begin to look at how strategy impacts the work that they do, how they better deliver service and value. But perhaps most importantly, in the role that she currently is in, she's really looking at how to transform the finance function of different businesses into business partners. In most instances, the finance function in many of our businesses has always been the section of the building, the section of the team, the section of the functional areas of the business that reports, that collects data, often pushes you and I with the deadlines, the requirements for things in specific formats, and with regulations and the like, really the rule keepers and the prefects of the playing field called business. But more and more, as we begin to take into account some of the catalytic changes that we see in our economies and ecosystems, more and more the finance function, particularly as it begins to converge with new ideas and technology, has been forced into a position where it is not just an analytical partner in the business, but a very key partner in providing us with key predictors and indicators in the business that can now take us forward. So Kimberly is going to share a little bit of the work that they've been working on from that thought leadership perspective globally at this point in time, and how they're assisting the finance function turn not only into a business partner, but into a transformation agent against some of the forces in our economies and societies that Kartik has shared with us today. So welcome to you again, Ms. Kimberly Ellison Taylor. So I'm going to kick off my very first question to you, Kartik, before I engage Kimberly a little bit further. I loved your presentation. And, you know, as you were reading through the 5 Rs, I was also just thinking about the 5 stages of grief that most of us have probably been through as our different economies and countries went through lockdowns, obviously the peaks of this particular pandemic. And then, of course, some of the shocks that we have since experienced in different spaces in our countries and economies. And as you spoke about how we resolve problems, how we build resilience, how we almost return to even some of those basics, reimagine who we are, and ultimately reform, I really wanted to ask you a question around, given this impact, and there's going to be no doubt rolling and ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic today, how do businesses who have to now integrate resilience as well as all these new ways of thinking and doing into their specific environments avoid change management fatigue? Because really what you pulled us through was that we're all going through this roller coaster. And so many of us, we're asking ourselves, when does the roller coaster stop? Or how do I better ride out the storm? Can you give us some insights in terms of how scenario planning can almost make us a far more stable guest on the roller coaster called life and business as we navigate 2020?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Lynette. So maybe a couple of thoughts, and I don't think anyone has a perfect answer to this. For most CEOs that I talk to, I think the way people are thinking about their own businesses is starting with, first, let me think about my people, right? The people that are in my company, let me take care of them. Does anybody have a health crisis? How do I make sure they're feeling okay? Health first, and then jobs itself and job safety and so on. The second thing they're starting to think about is, how do I think about my customers, right? So am I taking care of my customers the right way, especially in cases where there are customers who really need my products, whether it's healthcare products or food products and things like that? How do I think about that? And lastly, my shareholders and my community. How am I doing right by them? So I think in some ways that's sort of the North Star that I think we should have regardless of the crisis or not. I think this is just put a fine point on those three dimensions. So I would say any conversation on resilience or a new normal of behavior for companies starts with still thinking about those three things, except potentially a different way. The second broad thought I would have is this is probably a good time to think about just a new way of working and a new clock speed for the company, right? What I'm hearing the most from my clients is that we are reimagining our companies. We are reimagining what we thought was possible and the speed at which was possible. We're reimagining our entire business model. And frankly, we are reorganizing our company in much more agile formats. So one of my clients right now is thinking about how do I convert the entire company into agile squads, right? Instead of a classic functional organization structure that they have had for many, many years, how do I completely switch to agile squads is sort of one sort of model that they're thinking about. And part of it is about the crisis, but part of it is we realize that the world is going to evolve very, very fast. And this is just accelerate our thinking on that dimension. So that probably would be, in some ways, the best form of resilience, which is how do I get more agile in general? And then I think empowering the organization to react faster versus having top-down decision making. So that would be my first thought, but would love to hear others as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Kartik, for that. And I think, Kimberly, we throw around the term transformation, change, and it's particularly in the world of finance, we're throwing a lot of the responsibility of that in many organizations up to the finance function. Poor finance leaders, not only are they trying to balance profitability and make sure the business goes on, but now they are also balancing these new forces. How do they prioritize? And how do they use scenario planning now as a resource tool in the function to prioritize on those important steps that give us better results as we move forward?
Wow, there's so many thoughts, but I do want to just thank you for your very kind words. I am sitting here in Maryland, close to Washington, D.C., and absolutely delighted to join you today for this program and this very important topic. I couldn't agree more with Wayne's comments and certainly Kartik, so thank you for that. I would say from a finance perspective, and of course, I will certainly admit that I am biased, but finance has the best seat in the house, the best perspective on where we can start with making some key differences and changes in the organization. And so from a prioritization perspective, just trying to figure out what do we need to do to keep our people safe. I agree with Kartik. That was number one in the forefront of CEOs' minds. And that certainly has been a key highlight. Whenever I speak with my colleagues, they are very happy that their mental health and well-being and the care for their families were certainly in the forefront. Because let's face it, in as little as 2 to 3 days, we had stay-at-home orders. Everyone had to move home. They were still in the midst of financial consolidation and close processes, still responsible for meeting and complying with regulations. And at the same time, thinking about, oh my gosh, I now need to homeschool. How do I do all of those things? And so the sensitivity and flexibility exhibited by our leaders were very well taken. But from a prioritization perspective, we're now looking at what's our liquidity, our cash management, what are our capital structures? How do we ensure we have enough cash in order to pay our bills, in order to pay our people? How do we ensure that our books are robust enough to qualify and be eligible for government funding? And so in the initial days of the pandemic, and certainly as we see going forward, we're going to need finance even more to help identify areas of new opportunity. So as we look at to week, month to month, shorter scenario planning timeframes to figure out how do we maintain all of the balls we have juggling in the air, they certainly do have opportunities working with finance and working across the integrated team, HR, supply chain, the operational teams, to really look at some areas that would be new opportunities. So yes, we had to react very, very strongly, proactively, but now we have an opportunity, and I'll just add another R to the R's that were already listed, to reinvent ourselves. And so I absolutely agree that those 5 stages kind of did feel like the 5 stages of grief in a way. I absolutely see that. And now I think as we've gone through the initial, we've kept the balls in the air. Now we have to look forward to the future and say what's happening or what will happen on the other side of the pandemic.
Kimberly, just to expand on a thought, you were just pointing out that we now have to be scenario planning and strategically planning at far shorter intervals than we might have in the past. At the same time, we're collecting a lot of data, implementing and making decisions around that data, and having to very quickly test whether it's taking root and putting us on a new and very different course. With all of this course changing, there are obviously going to be costs, whether the costs are related to talent, the resources that we use, or even tools that we use within our organizations. And obviously businesses are very sensitive at this point in time about any type of new cost over and above the actual brunt that they have borne. Where do we then fit the issue of cost efficiency, resource efficiency, and those type of measures into this scenario planning? And how do we balance out the need to keep moving forward and obviously respond with sustainability and obviously just spending really economically and wisely?
I love that you said in your question, spending wisely, because I think that is important. There's probably no way to just cut ourselves out of this problem, but we can be prudent about what we spend our monies on, and certainly looking at key performance indicators around customer segmentation and looking at our supply chain for vulnerabilities and weaknesses that might exist would be some areas that we should certainly identify. But then even more closely and more specifically close to home, we could also identify areas that just were not critical to our business. We were doing them, but they really didn't add anything. And I would say that we had a lot of those things. When you're in a successful environment, you probably don't look at those as closely as you would when you're now looking under every rock, every other stone to figure out how do we ensure that we can thrive going forward. And so we also have to pay attention to that. Correlation isn't causation. And that's why I'm always very cautious. And I've been in environments and I've spoken with our colleagues who, yes, we could cut to zero if we needed to. But in some instances, we have to spend to save. And so we saw investments in cloud solutions. We saw investments in more integrated planning systems. We saw investments in Oracle. And so that was absolutely what was necessary. Because if we were in an environment where we were planning completely off of spreadsheets, in silos, and not working across the enterprise, those issues were highlighted. And so it's difficult to identify completely where you can make prudent cost-cutting areas by yourself. Finance has to be a business partner, and we have to work in connection with the rest of the organization and the rest of the leaders in order to know where we can grow and cut costs at the same time. And I know that sounds like it's mutually exclusive. And you're saying, Kimberly, how are you saying we're going to grow and cut costs? But those two things can absolutely happen in tandem because we're going to be looking at new business models. And I know organizations are already considering new ways of operating.
All right. So thank you very much, Kimberly, for those responses. Kartik, if I can come back to you, as you were mapping us through some of the data that you have seen and sourced from around the world as well as the region, you touched on the issue of how businesses were either restructuring themselves, forming new businesses from some of the seismic changes, choosing to sustain, or finding that they were really having to revisit their business models as a whole. As you were also speaking about that, I know that the common thread for me that began to weave through that conversation is that enablement, integration, and partnership would probably become some of the biggest priorities that any company, irrespective of where it found itself on the quadrants you were speaking of, would probably need to prioritize fairly quickly. And of course, you spoke about the change even in our social contracts and that we have between the private and the public sector. We probably are all just in the 5 Rs, probably at the point of either return or reimagining ourselves. The businesses, the institutions, the governments that are going to make it. What are, in your view, are they going to focus on at this point in time, particularly as we move from return to reimagination? Because I think we all agree what was normal before no longer applies. And we've probably all got to rebuild. But as we rebuild and we recharts the ground we will stand on, the institutions that are going to really be firm in their new groundings, what are they going to focus on and why are they going to win?
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'll probably answer that in three parts. The first is, what are these, it sort of builds on your previous question and stuff that Kimberly talked about as well. What are these companies facing first? Second, what are the institutional mechanisms they're putting in place? And thirdly, sort of, what are the actions they might take, right? So if I think about the actual things they're facing in terms of how they might make decisions, it's effectively strategy under extreme uncertainty, right? It's basically what everybody's facing at this point. And the pitfalls one has are 3 or 4, right? One is, I'd call it optimism bias, right? You might say, look, this is actually going to get better faster than I think it might, right? The economy might recover, right? So there's a clear optimism bias that I'm seeing with certain executives, and you can make wrong decisions because of that. The second one is, I'll call it information instability. That could actually lead to wrong answers. Some information you got today might actually be wrong because the actual sources of information are changing quite rapidly nowadays, right? But also the actual underlying data is changing quite rapidly. So that instability tends to potentially lead to potentially wrong answers. A third one is paralysis by analysis, right? Like too much analysis, in fact, and just not making decisions fast enough. And the last one is something you alluded to in your first question to me, which is just organization exhaustion, right? So those are some sort of you just are tired to make the calls that one needs to. So I'll say those are the things that I would say companies are facing at this point, which when you have extreme uncertainty makes the decision choices even harder. So the second bucket is, what do you do when you have that level of uncertainty going on? And we're seeing 3 things companies typically from an organization construct try to set up. One is, I'll say, an early warning system, right? Figuring out how do I get early signals from my spokes or basically my tentacles, right? And that doesn't take a long time to reach the decision makers, right? So getting early warning systems, getting it fast is one thing that a lot of companies are setting up, and even governments are setting up, by the way, right? In one government, we actually helped one of the governments set up an early warning system around food price shocks, right? So we literally looked at every major market in the country and we're checking food prices every day, basically across like 10 different commodities, right? During the peak of the crisis, basically. So that's just an example at a government level, but companies are doing that with their supply chains on. That's the first. The second thing that I see companies doing is set up an integrated nerve center or control room, whatever you want to call it. Different companies have different names for this. By the way, even governments are doing this, calling it a business situation room, like the government of Kenya does, something else in other countries and so on, where you can bring all the different information pieces together to have a holistic picture, so you're making a better decision, right? So you're not just making decisions on individual piece of information, which goes back, I think, to Kimberly's point on why finance has a very good perspective, because you actually do look at lots of different pieces come together in that function. Right? And the third thing I see companies doing is align on a set of operating principles across the company very fast, which is where does decision authority lie and how has that changed pre-COVID to now? Am I actually allowing my managers and administrators at more junior levels to take decisions and will not blame them if that decision goes off, because the likelihood of things being off are higher at this point, but then the early warning system allows me to change it if I need to, right? So aligning in a different set of operating principles, different agility, as we talked about earlier, is the other thing that we're seeing. So that's sort of the set of things that I'm seeing companies put in place to manage the near-term emergency type situation. And then the third part of the answer would be, what are sort of the longer-term actions that companies are taking, the strategic choices, right? Number one, I would say, is taking that business, a real look at the business model and saying, what can we do fundamentally differently, whether it's in terms of my internal operations and work from home and all that stuff, but also in terms of how do I interact with my customers and all that, right, and stakeholders. So this complete business model shifts, frankly, even where my industry is going, right? Is there going to be massive consolidation in my industry or not, right? Is where money flows and investment into the space, is that fundamentally going to change? For example, in infrastructure or in tourism or in retail, is that going to happen? So taking a really significant perspective, which is 5-10 years out, and having a view on what I need to do based on that. Based on that, also thinking about M&A activity much more seriously. I feel there are many more people more willing to engage in alliances and acquisition conversations now than they were a year ago, right? So that's a very interesting development. And then I would say a very big look at your own digital infrastructure and capabilities, right? How robust is it for now and for the future? And the types of investments, especially on the capability side, that will take some years to pay off at times, but are we doing the right thing on those dimensions? So those are some of the things that I'm seeing and what companies I think are doing and can do.
All right. So thank you so much, Kartik. Kartik, I'm just really stealing from one of your responses, particularly around how do you set up the best possible war room to help you through the storm, but also transform post the storm. I think I'm going to pose that question back to Kimberly. Kimberly, who should be at the table? Whether you're in a big business, a smaller business, an institution, a government, who should be at this table? Because it's quite clear that you can't have the usual C-suite and the usual people at the table. But based on what we're hearing from the both of you, we probably need a whole new set of new players who are going to bring a new energy and new ideas to it. Who would you put at yours?
Absolutely. Great question. It's definitely not business as usual. And I would say that the people on the front line of the sales organization, of HR, of supply chaining, of finance are definitely people that should be on the table, not necessarily the leaders. It's the people who are on the ground who probably have superhero vision. They've already said, why do we do it this way? Or why aren't we doing this? They are catalysts and ambassadors of change. They understand the evolving customer dynamics. They've probably seen it coming for years and did not have the ability to speak up or add their voice into the changes happening inside the organization. So yes, we've traditionally had some top-down leadership initiatives, but I think a lot of these things are going to now come from a crowdsourced team to bring their ideas and have impact on the scenario planning in a much shorter time frame and horizon than we've had before. So we can't do 3 to 5 years. We can't do only C-suite leaders. We can't just go in our own conference rooms and finance do it by themselves. We're definitely going to need an integrated planning solution like our solution at Oracle that will help our customers and clients move through what is a very difficult time.
Kimberly, on that note, one of the questions that has been posed to us in our chat today by Melanie van der Bijl is, would government, for instance, would governments around the world, and I won't just say a South African government or an African government, governments around the world, would they be able to adapt and adopt that capability model that is inclusive, that's integrated, that calls on so many diverse voices into the room and needs to collect data so rapidly. How do, in those spaces where, as part of this group project, as the world gets out of COVID-19, we really do need a lot of the institutional decision making to also come from those levels as well. What do they do in that instance? Are they capable of that type of a very robust change as well?
It's interesting.
Nodding.
It's interesting that she would ask me, because I'm not sure if I'm the best person from the United States right now to offer that. But I will say this, just a small joke. I will say this: necessity is the mother of invention. We have no choice. We have moved forward 3 to 5 years in our thinking, and business as usual will no longer apply. I'm sure our governments did not anticipate that they would be doing as much as they are doing right now. But I do believe that ensuring we have a diversity of thought and an inclusive team across functions, across people, across industries, and organizations of all sizes, the government can absolutely help us with those very tough discussions and help us try to move the economy along.
Right. So thank you very much, Kimberly. And as we had promised you, safe passage and of course hospitality.
Yes.
Karthik, let me also come to you on the same question as well, because no doubt in the role that you play in right now, you interact quite a lot with the public service from that capability building perspective. Over and above the public service, which may in fact be one of the slower adopters of some of the transformational changes and even technologies we've had to go through, what other industries do you see as early adopters and even some of the later adopters who can hurry up and get their act together? And with that, thank you very much to Arjen Viesma, who asked a question to us today about that late and early adoption. Thanks, Karthik.
Sure. So first is, if I might, I'm not quite sure that I would say that governments are necessarily slow or late adopters. I think the scale of what governments need to do is actually much more significant than what it is for any one company. And the scale of the challenge as well is much more significant. I see some governments doing pretty remarkable things in response to the crisis. The kinds of applications, the kind of early warning signals that some of these governments have rolled out with technology has been pretty remarkable, actually, around the world, by the way. So that's just one context. I think there's just a lot more to do. Was I think the point I was making earlier as well. In terms of early adopters, late adopters, I think on the obviously the technology sector itself, whether it's the telecom companies, whether it's the ICT companies, by definition, are adopting their own medicine faster than many of the other companies, right? Even they have a lot more to do. But that's one sector we're seeing quite a lot. We're actually seeing quite a bit in the healthcare sector, interestingly. And we're also seeing quite a lot in manufacturing, especially around the world. It's starting to happen in Africa as well, the use of artificial intelligence technologies and machine learning and so on. We're starting to see that around the world for sure, use of sensors and so on. So those are some of the areas, and obviously retail trade, where we've had e-commerce for a long time, right? So there we're seeing that. I think we're also seeing very, very strong activity in the financial sector, especially retail banking and retail insurance. We're seeing a lot of that there as well. I think we're seeing more on B2B, which is interesting because historically, a lot of technology adoption had been happening faster on B2C dimensions, but I think we're starting to see that people are willing to make sales even on B2B sales through digital channels and so on. So we're starting to see that as well. I think channels, on sectors that have been that still have a lot of room. I would say, I don't know if I want to comment on sort of speed yet, but they definitely have a lot of room, right? It's probably a better way to think about this because different companies are at different speeds. I would say agriculture has a lot of room in terms of digital adoption, especially in Africa. It's a huge sector. It's essentially almost a third of all of Africa's GDP, basically, and almost 60% of all of employment, right? So that's a very significant sector, I would say. I think there are other sectors like tourism as well, which could be much more digitally enabled and so on, which I think we'll see a lot more coming out of this, but had not been the case historically in Africa. I think it'd been much more the case in other continents. So that would be sort of some reactions to your question.
All right. Thank you so much for that response, Kartik. And thank you to our viewers in their offices this afternoon for posing some of those questions to us. As we begin to wrap up and close this conversation, and I enjoy this subject and this topic, so I could talk about it all afternoon. But from the both of you, and Wayne, perhaps if you also want to chip into this one, I'd really also welcome your insights on it because you set our scene. The leaders who are listening to us today in the various functions of their businesses, the C-suite, the boards, those who govern and regulate, for each of them, if each of you were to give them 2 priorities to focus on, particularly as they create partnerships between functions such as finance, technology, their people, and even their processes, what would you give them as 2 priorities that can almost act as their silver bullets that can set the scene and almost set the pace for their organizations and teams as they step into 2021?
Which one?
Well, Kimberly, you are on the line now.
Yeah.
Welcome to go for it. And then perhaps with Kartik and we close with Wayne. Thank you.
The first one I'm going to say is always around people and bringing people along with shared purpose, shared values, aligning to the mission and putting purpose at the core of the strategy, I think is always going to be important. People are concerned about their own livelihoods. They're worried. If we were to think about the impacts of this pandemic on our physical health, mental health, financial health, there are just a lot of different components. And as Kartik mentioned earlier in his remarks, it is wide ranging. And so if we don't have people who are aligned and understand the change management of it and what's in it for them, they're not going to bring their best selves to work to help reorganize and reform the organization. So I think it's definitely people. Secondly, I would say it's leveraging technology in order to reduce costs in some areas and to free up time and to free up resources so that investments can be made in other places. And definitely leveraging cloud solutions and an integrated planning platform is going to put them a lot farther ahead than if they were operating in silos with spreadsheets, doing lots of manual work. And fortunately for us, Oracle leverages our own solutions. We drink our own champagne. Wayne mentioned earlier, we closed our books 20% faster. And we've seen similar things with a shorter planning horizon that we've done in our own balance sheet operations and review to make sure we're financially healthy and viable. We would do that for other organizations as well.
All right. So thank you so much, Kimberly, for those 2 main priorities to focus on. Kartik, over to you.
I like both of Kimberly's. I think to build on that, I think the 2 I would say is number 1, speed, and number 2, boldness. I think regardless of whichever topic you pick, I think speed of action and failing fast and fixing it, and then the boldness of ideas and solutions and action is I think what will separate the more resilient organizations from the ones that from others. So those would be my 2.
Thank you so much, Kartik. And Wayne, we invite you back to give us your top priorities and tips for the clients and the audience who are listening to us today.
Yes. Thank you, Lynette. I think, I agree with both Kartik and Kimberly. I think almost to echo on Kimberly's is, it's all been about, the topic has been focused a little bit around the finance, but as Kimberly mentioned before, it's the people around finance. So look at every bit of your organization, be it supply chain, manufacturing, sales, get everybody involved. So you get a true picture of what's going on and, get everybody to understand where you're going and contribute to that message. And I think for me, the big thing is, a lot of companies went into survival mode, but look forward, almost to Cortexing, be bold, imagine the new tomorrow, because things will get better. And we've seen as customers, have grown. So be bold, look into the future, reimagine what you can be going forward, I think is very key.
And I think, ladies and gentlemen, on that very note, reimagine the future, be bold, but whilst you also do so, there are resources, tools, there is help and support, and of course, some fantastic integrations that each of us through this crisis have the opportunity to experiment with, test, discuss, and dissect, but perhaps most importantly, begin to create new ways to win and remain productive as we face the future boldly. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Lynette Nduli. It's been an absolute pleasure sharing the afternoon with yourselves. A Business Day Focus 4.0, as well as the team at Oracle that so kindly partnered and hosted us here this afternoon. Should you have any additional thoughts, should you have any additional questions, and want to, of course, receive more information about the session that we have just had, if you were a guest on this session today, you will receive an email post the session that will summarize our engagement today. And within the context of that email, you will have the opportunity as well to touch base with the various teams and the various pieces of data that were also shared here today. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to everybody who contributed their questions and answers as well on the chat. And we look forward, of course, that at the next one, you will have, fresh ideas, fresh product ideas even to bring to this particular table. And the two teams are, of course, always open to hearing what your views, your challenges are at home so we can create new opportunities and, of course, the new horizons we are here to create together. Have a wonderful afternoon.